You had an intellectual opposition to communism before you came here. Now that you've been hit by one, what do you think?
Well, I wouldn't fight back physically, but I'm mad, and I'll fight. I'll do it at home, telling people, talking, doing as much as I can against communism in the United States.
Is it not high time we ask ourselves?
Anti-communism didn't start in America, but the American brand of anti-communism was undoubtedly unique. The fear of communism began with the spread of communist revolutions throughout Europe following the Bolshevik Revolution during the First World War. In the United States, many feared that recent immigrants and dissidents who supported communist, socialist, and anarchist ideologies would cause a similar revolution in America. The media inflamed these fears, claiming that the new and radical movements would compromise American culture. They portrayed them as radical threats to American society, because support for these new movements was growing, emerging as possible solutions to poverty. But the media had to keep this secret from the people, because admitting it would undermine American values and belief in the economic system, a belief that was essential for the ruling class. The American people were thrown into a panic by the media, afraid for their churches, their houses, and their way of life.
Here it is what the communists are doing, not to me. They're doing it to people with 1 billion of men. Here it is, here it is, here it is, here it is, here it is. Just look, I don't care about what anybody objects. He should object against what is happening in America, this collusion and this apathy towards those who torture Christians.
Of course, revolution does not mean violence in the sense that that's its defining characteristic.
Yet there are those who see it that way.
Well, that's done in a very conscious manner to mislead people and to lead people to, for instance, equate a progressive socialist revolution with fascism.
But the fear that was developing was not all due to paranoia, as many of the emerging movements were known to use violence to undermine power and authority. As World War I came to an end, government agencies removed their controls on the economy, and businesses began raising prices on goods that were required to be kept low during the war. In an age where the world had witnessed unparalleled carnage and destruction, those who survived would now be confronted with the specter of economic instability, and the only way of avoiding disaster was to think collectively. As post-war inflation began to rise, workers started joining labor forces, and the number of strikes increased to record levels. Threatened by the rise in collective action, the press once again delegitimized labor strikes, calling them crimes against society who were plotting to establish communism.
After World War I, people had the impression that radical views, radical leftist, Marxist, communist, socialist views were being carried into our society by immigrant elements. In other words, this was a foreign phenomenon that was brought into our midst, and people took excitement from this and opposed it in very stupid and silly ways.
Then, in April of 1919, when public fear about left-wing radicalism was already high, Italian anarchist Luigi Galleani mailed 36 boxes packed with sticks of dynamite to powerful members of the government, newspaper editors, and businessmen. Galleani was deported from the United States, but the consequences of the anarchist bombings would trigger a wave of paranoia. As a reaction to the labor movements and anarchist bombings, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer led a witch hunt that resulted in illegal search and seizure, unwarranted arrests, and the deportation of several hundred suspected anarchists.
Activities against which people were reacting in this Red Scare era, most of them were anarchist activities, not communist. anarchist activities of which the Bolsheviki in Russia did not approve at all. They, of course, were making their own efforts all during the 1920s and in part in the 1930s to build up a communist party in this country, and they conceived of it as a revolutionary party. Had it had sufficient success, it would have tried to seize power. So there was a certain legitimate cause for complaint on the American side.
Many prominent lawyers publicly scrutinized the Palmer raids, but despite its totalitarian nature, this would be the first of many incidents of its kind, in an era that would soon become known as the Red Scare. Through the chaos and destruction of the first half of the 20th century, emerged two central figures, both of which carried extraordinary amounts of power. Anti-communism erupted after 1945, and the shaky relationship between the two superpowers had begun to crumble by the end of the war. Joseph Stalin, refusing to be bound by the agreements made by the Allies at the Yalta Conference, extended his power across half of Europe. Once anti-communists were able to prove that communist agents had stolen classified secrets and engaged in espionage during wartime, anti-communism would quickly find itself as the focal point in American politics, in a far more aggressive manner than ever before.
I want to emphasize how easy it is for you to perform a real service. Whoever you are, wherever you are, discuss the Red Menace with your neighbors, your friends, your business associates, your fellow students. The party is in a drive to get communist speakers into our colleges and universities, taking advantage of American academic freedom and the students' naturally inquiring minds. Their aim is to preach revolutionary tactics and change peaceful campuses into scenes like this. The communist-incited student riots in San Francisco. Communist agents make more progress where they can first make trouble.
As the Soviet-American alliance deteriorated, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover once again began sending the White House reports about alleged communist spies within the government. The increasing tensions with Russia had led Hoover to believe that he would have to start arresting communist sympathizers, as he had during the Palmer raids of the first Red Scare. Hoover kept in mind, however, that the Palmer raids had been derailed because he had not properly worked out the logistics of the detention program, and that this time, he needed superiors and political allies who would defend him from the inevitable backlash of these questionable actions. In order to do this, Hoover developed a program that would shape the public opinion in favor of the Bureau's actions if the FBI decided to make extensive arrests of suspected communists. This became the Bureau's mass media program, an organized effort by the Bureau's top executives and field supervisors to mobilize public opinion against communism. The FBI's presence in popular entertainment escalated dramatically.
I want to talk to you fighting men and women about the battle of the United States.
Just start again. All right. Just wait a second. Wait a second. Drop your hands to your back to the table. That's it.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the G-Men. This is a Bureau of Scientific Crime Detection. New, modern, up to the minute, in action day and night. The FBI never sleeps. The G-Men have become a legend. So what's the mystery behind their badge? There's heroism, we know that.
And in a strategic political move, Hoover went as far as condemning the White House, claiming that President Truman's administration was failing to take the Bureau's warnings about communism seriously. It was now to Hoover, not the White House, that the media turned to for authoritative analysis on domestic communism.
Mr. Allen, why is it that everything the other side says is propaganda while we call what we say information?
Lindley, the word propaganda has taken on a very bad connotation. It was originally a perfectly good word, but it brings to people's minds now the idea of twisting or distorting the truth or even manufacturing complete falsehoods. Whereas we try in our service, our output, to give as straight the factual presentation as we can, and we feel that that is information and should be labeled that, not called propaganda.
Now, in a few minutes, Jerry Donovan will be asleep. But tonight, instead of the sweet dreams his wife wished him, let's give Jerry a nightmare, a real red nightmare. Now, you remember that Russian town we saw earlier? The town that looked like it belonged in Kansas or Ohio or Vermont? Let's lift that town out of the Soviet Union. Let's superimpose it on Jerry's hometown. And those precious freedoms Jerry so complacently accepts. Let's see how many freedoms Jerry might lose if suddenly he had to live under communist domination.
This was not invented by a Russian. The man's name was Bell, Alexander Graham Bell. And he was an American. Get that, comrade. Everything on this table is as phony as the town. The rotten system you call communism.
The Americans feared the Soviets would continue to dominate Eastern Europe and spread communist values to Western democracies. Mainland China, too, had a communist revolution under the rule of leader Mao Zedong. The growth of communism internationally, in tandem with the propaganda program led by Hoover, gave the American population a sense that their backs were pushed against a wall. And on top of this, by the late 40s, the Soviet atomic program had successfully tested their very own atomic weapon, raising the level of anxiety for the Americans, who were no longer the only ones with access to such a level of destructive power. High levels of anxiety have been known to cause irrational reactions in populations, and the Cold War was a near-perfect example of such a social phenomenon. Panic over communist subversion began to spread across the country at a staggering rate, as many prominent anti-communists throughout society began to push the narrative that anyone among the population could be a communist sympathizer, or worse, a spy. Among them was a young Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan, whose voice can be heard narrating this anti-communist documentary.
Hello. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch. 4 out of every 10 of the world's population oppressed. And the conspiracy that is communism is stronger, more determined than ever, growing in the image of its leaders.
Convinced that communists were trying to take over the Hollywood film and arts industry, Ronald Reagan began work as an FBI informant. Under the code name T-10, Reagan exposed the names of actors within the film industry that were alleged communist sympathizers. This was only one example of informant activity that was taking place during the Red Scare and the Cold War. Thousands of Americans were accusing individuals of being communists or sympathizers, often without reasonable suspicion, losing their jobs and becoming blacklisted by communities as a result. Appearing through the anxiety and confusion was a senator who saw this as an opportunity and pushed the Red Scare to a new level. His name was Joseph McCarthy.
You no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
I'll say it hurts.
May I say, Mr. Chairman, as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to finish this.
Senator, I think it hurts you too, sir.
I'd like to finish this.
Senator McCarthy was considered a patriotic American by some and a paranoid nationalist by others. As political repression and persecution of left-wing individuals raged at the height of the Cold War, U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy started a campaign of fear against individuals, which he claimed were known communists working for the United States government. On February 9, 1950, at the Republican Women's Club in West Virginia, McCarthy gave one of the most significant speeches in American political history, brandishing a piece of paper that he claimed was the list of individuals who were alleged communist sympathizers. This pivotal moment early in the Cold War propelled McCarthy into the limelight. He was now the face of anti-communism in an American society that was under the spell of fear. But McCarthy was about to become familiar with a reality that only few throughout history have experienced. A reality that would be taken over by a desire for power.
The thing that the American people can do is to be vigilant day and night to make sure they don't have communists teaching the sons and daughters of America. Now, I realize that the minute anyone tries to get a communist out of a college, out of a university, there will be raised the phony cry that you're interfering with academic freedom. I would like to emphasize that there is no academic freedom where a communist is concerned.
From 1950 to 1954, a twisted form of anti-communism based on the lies told by McCarthy and his followers would wreak havoc on American political civility. In Washington, he aligned himself with other known anti-communists like J. Edgar Hoover, who aided him in his attempts to substantiate his wild accusations. Alongside the other anti-communist government committees, the McCarthy movement took advantage of the suspicions that were lingering in the corner of everyone's mind. Suspicions that communists were attempting to infiltrate and destabilize the United States internally. Politicians began following in the footsteps of McCarthy as they smeared policies made by their progressive counterparts as being part of a communist agenda. Anyone who failed to agree with the anti-communists would be met with a hail of accusations and often investigated.
No remote possibility of this ending except by victory or by death for this civilization.
One of the most sensational examples of this was the trial of former State Department official Alger Hiss. The case against Hiss began when Whittaker Chambers, an ex-communist, testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, claiming that Hiss was a communist. Hiss appeared before the committee and denied the charges, claiming that he did not even know Chambers. Chambers retaliated by claiming Hiss was not merely a communist, but also a spy. In the midst of the chaotic trial, the committee appointed a young California congressman by the name of Richard Nixon to determine who was telling the truth. Eager to prove himself, Nixon subpoenaed all remaining evidence against Alger Hiss. He was determined not to let this opportunity get away from the anti-communist movement.
The only answer to communism is a massive offensive for freedom. Freedom from hunger, from disease, and a victory for the ageless hope of people everywhere. Freedom from tyranny.
Chambers revealed to Nixon that Alger Hiss had given him classified State Department documents and microfilmed copies of these papers. Chambers had hidden the papers in a hollowed-out pumpkin on his Maryland farm, giving the documents the famous nickname, the Pumpkin Papers.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm, a very highly confidential, secret
State Department documents. These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing that these documents were sent to the Soviet Union.
Although the evidence was questionable, Hiss was convicted of 2 counts of perjury and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Nixon's effort to expose alleged communists was a dramatic moment during the McCarthy era and launched his political career in a controversial way. Like Nixon, McCarthy also took advantage of his position as head of the Senate Investigations Committee and used it for a number of unconstitutional communist hunting investigations. Of the 653 people called by the committee during a 15-month period, 83 refused to answer questions about alleged espionage and communist subversion. The names of those who were summoned were made public and subjected to public scrutiny. McCarthy and his followers became untouchable as political adversaries kept their distance out of fear of implication. But not everyone believed McCarthy's antics, as skeptics began to point out inconsistencies in his bold claims. One of those individuals was famed journalist Edward R. Murrow, who solidified his place as one of the leading figures in journalism during his weekly television program, See It Now.
But I would like to say this: confidence by itself without effort does not win contests. Victory in this conflict depends on much, much more than confidence. It is a contest unlike any we have ever faced in our history as a nation. It is total competition with an antagonist who is putting into it everything within his capability.
A month after it premiered, See It Now aired a broadcast exposing the misinformation being disseminated by Joseph McCarthy. Murrow used excerpts from McCarthy's speeches to point out inconsistencies in his claims, leading to a nationwide backlash against McCarthy. Murrow's broadcast was a historic moment for journalism, but McCarthy rejected Murrow's criticism and doubled down on his actions, criticizing Murrow of being a communist sympathizer. By now it was the mid-50s, and Cold War tensions were slowly winding down, but many criticized sitting President Eisenhower of not confronting McCarthy about his behavior. McCarthy, like Eisenhower, was part of the Republican Party, and in order to pass bills, Eisenhower needed to keep the party unified. Eisenhower feared that criticism of McCarthy would only lead to an internal struggle within the party, so he avoided the situation altogether.
Coming months will be fraught with fateful decisions. Decisions which will lead this world out of fear and into peace.
But then, everything suddenly changed, as McCarthy turned his investigatory resources on the US Army and on members of Eisenhower's administration itself. McCarthy claimed communists had infiltrated the Army's Signal Corps Laboratory, the branch of the military that manages the communications and information systems for the command and control of the combined armed forces. Eisenhower now had no choice but to take action against McCarthy, who had grown obsessed with his own power. The White House first planned to pull the plug on the investigation by discrediting the men around McCarthy, notably the lawyer Roy Cohn, who worked as McCarthy's chief counsel. Cohn was known for his aggressive questioning of suspected communists off the record, behind closed doors.
Well, if the FBI has got a firm grasp on these 130 men, I'll go to sleep. Do you assure me that's so?
Sir, I'm sure that the FBI does its job well, that it knows all about these people, that it has told the appropriate agencies about these people, and that the failure to act goes elsewhere than just in the hands of the FBI.
I think we can give him that, and just by giving him documents, I think it'll be necessary to hold a meeting of the committee and have the staff give as complete a picture as they can of the information we have on the communist infiltration of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA.
The Army compiled a damaging dossier of dirt on Cohn, showing that he used threats and intimidation. The White House then leaked this dossier to the press and Congress. both Cohen and McCarthy stood accused with the abuse of power. But Eisenhower wasn't done just yet, as he stripped McCarthy's ability to call upon witnesses to testify before his committee. Consumed by power, McCarthy had violated a cardinal rule by betraying the Eisenhower administration, and as a consequence, the era of McCarthyism was over. But fear of communism in America had not yet seen its demise.
These are leaders of the nationwide youth organization that calls itself SDS, Students for a Democratic Society.
I'm Mike Klonsky, National Secretary of SDS, and this is Bernadine Dorn, Interorganizational Secretary.
So you'll be what you were. Is there a communist faction making a big power play for SDS at this time?
Is there any communists back here?
I guess there is.
Are there communists in this organization?
There are communists in the organization, there's no doubt about that. There are also liberals in the organization.
3 years later, McCarthy died of complications due to alcoholism. But the political repression started by the McCarthy era would continue on. For the Americans, the 50s were a chaotic time, but the 1960s would quickly become one of the most tumultuous decades in American history. Television became widely available to virtually all Americans, and an entire decade of social turmoil would unfold right before their eyes.
I would say to residents that actually live in the precinct are law-abiding.
The everyday average working man, the respectable people, we have no problems at all.
The only time they don't like you is when you catch them doing something they're not supposed to be doing.
And all the time I've been here, I've never really had any problems with the community itself. I don't consider this, riffraff and whatnot out here in the street part of the community.
Plagued by philosophical differences among its members, anti-communists after the McCarthy era struggled through an identity crisis in the early 60s. They shifted their gaze from communism within the country outward. They would look east, far away to a land that was foreign to much of the American public. To unify the entire country under a single regime, the North Vietnamese government modeled their own political system after the Soviet Union. But this was opposed by the South Vietnamese, who employed a democratic system for their government. As the divisions between North and South Vietnam grew wider, the USA became fearful that communism would spread to South Vietnam, and then the rest of Asia. The Soviets and Chinese supported the efforts of the North Vietnamese and poured weapons and supplies into the country. Once again, out of fear, the United States allowed chaos and paranoia to take control. But this time, the impact of anti-communist paranoia was not only limited to social scorn as it was during the first Red Scare and the McCarthy era. Instead, it would reveal itself in a deadly way.
In practice, I'm afraid the American president will have to decide that it is not worth it, and it will therefore encourage the piecemeal taking over of the world by Soviet aggression.
Because you believe the Soviets understand our unwillingness or inability, certainly our unwillingness to wage an all-out war?
The Soviets will understand our increasing unwillingness to engage in this kind of war, and therefore their task will be to present us with a challenge which doesn't ever seem worth taking the final jump, but which the accumulation of which is going to lead to the destruction of the free world.
You stupid idiots, What's your name, sir? Never mind my name. I'm from Hungary. I'm a freedom fighter. I fought the communists. The bastards! The idiotic anti-communists. You stupid idiots. It's a disgrace what you are doing here against your own country. I'm ashamed for America. And I'm not an American. I'm a Hungarian.
Who have died in this war.
The many people who died, people die since time immemorial. There's nothing new. People is dying for freedom. People has to die for their children, for their future, for a free America like you here now.
Well, I just joined the battery about a week ago as executive officer. My second day here, we fired over 1,800 rounds, which is more than I've ever seen any battery fire in one day. At the end of the day, I told the battery that I was proud to be a part of it, and that still goes.
Does that mean you think the war is going well?
I definitely think it is.
Because you're misled. Deep inside, I'm sure you're all very, very decent people. And you want the best for humanity. But humanity is finished in the communist countries. You should be not shot, that's too good for you. Do you know what it means having communists go to Hungary, to Czechoslovakia?
Are they attacking you with their mortars?
Yes, they are.
Are they hurting you?
They aren't really hurting us very badly. However, the psychological aspect of it is pretty big. When I was with A Battery, we got mortared one time, and it's really quite an experience.
You will realize when it's too late.
Alongside the Vietnam War, the 1961 U.S.-supported coup attempt against Cuba at the Bay of Pigs was a disaster for the fledgling Kennedy administration, marking a shaky start to the 1960s. Kennedy was famously assassinated only years later by former U.S. Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, who was allegedly a communist sympathizer. Similarly to his rival John F. Kennedy, now President Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968, was far more interested in foreign policy than domestic affairs. Nixon had gained considerable experience since the Pumpkin Papers and the trial of Alger Hiss. But he was a complicated man who was plagued with anxieties during his time as president. A deeply introverted personality with the job of an extrovert. Yet despite these setbacks, he was able to rely on his remarkable intellectual ability and understanding of political science to carry him through some of the most tumultuous points of the 20th century. President Nixon believed he could transform relations with the Soviet Union and establish diplomacy with the People's Republic of China. And when he saw an opportunity to do so, he took it.
President Nixon's departure for China. South Lawn, 17 February 1972.
In 1972, he met with Chinese Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong and began establishing diplomatic relations with the communist leader.
But what we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war.
Have postponed the dinner?
I've never seen them pay any attention, but they always start on the second. I mean, they're never late.
Start on the second and end on the hour.
But I think they, again, just judging by my October trip, they'll get it done in 2 hours in the plenary session because you'll make a statement, he'll make a statement, and there'll be some general agreement on how to proceed.
President, the chance you've had to see?
Well, I haven't had very much, but the Great Wall and the Forbidden City and today, of course, has been really outstanding. But it's like the sightseeing I've had is like the hors d'oeuvre of a Chinese dinner. I'd like to have more.
How was the entree?
This is the hors d'oeuvre. I'd like to come back to see it. I mean, to do the sightseeing. But the Prime Minister and I have been a little busy on occasion, so we haven't had quite the time for sightseeing. But we were doing things that were more important.
Yeah. And we're going to invite you to another banquet this evening.
That's right. Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
His well-established reputation as an anti-communist gave him political cover against any criticisms that could have been made that he was weak on the communist ideology. By strengthening relations with the communists, Nixon was able to use Beijing as leverage to pressure North Vietnam to end the war. It was a bold and effective strategy.
I can only say to the navionists like myself who've never seen it before that it exceeds all expectations. We hope, maybe, that the walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this, or whether they are other walls of ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world.
that peoples, regardless of their differences in backgrounds and their philosophies, will have an opportunity to communicate with each other, to know each other, and to share with each other those particular endeavors that will mean peaceful progress in the years ahead.
We are now in the final hours of the President's momentous visit. This farewell banquet here in Shanghai, keep it rolling. We are now in the final hours of the President's momentous visit.
Nixon had hoped to ease tensions of the Cold War and gain credit for it, and his presidency was well on the way to do so. But then, the same blinding tendency of power that had caused the downfall of McCarthy would find its way into the mind of Richard Nixon. On June 17, 1972, at an office complex in Washington, D.C., 5 burglars, 4 of which were former CIA, were caught burglarizing the office of the Democratic National Committee. The scandal was linked back to President Nixon, setting off one of the biggest political scandals in American history, known as Watergate. The FBI had determined that the Watergate break-in was part of a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage on behalf of the Nixon re-election committee. This was hardly a new phenomenon by this point, as the McCarthy era fostered the growth of paranoid and suspicious behavior within the government and the American population. Richard Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, and his efforts to thaw the Cold War are seen as a minor footnote by comparison to the Watergate scandal. By the mid-70s, the Vietnam War had finally come to an end, taking the lives of as many as 2 million civilians and over 1 million military personnel. Cold War tensions between communist countries and the United States began to fade. But in the 1980s, a new era of fear would soon begin, as a familiar face would take control. When distorted media campaigns like the Red Scare are used to create fear and exacerbate pre-existing divisions, our perceptions of the world can quickly become warped. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more content like this, subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. And if you feel like it, check out my podcast. I'll put the link for that in the description below.